So shall we start now?
Yes.
Okay. A very warm good evening to everyone. On behalf of the seminar committee of the History Department, Delhi University, I welcome you all to today's lecture by Dr. Vasileios Syros. I extend my warm welcome to Dr. Syros and welcome you on behalf of everyone to our weekly seminar series. Today's talk, as Sir has already mentioned, is by Dr. Vasileios Syros, the director of Early Modern Greek Culture Program at the Medici Archive Project and Urs Huttonen Fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge. His main research interests lie in medieval and early modern intellectual history. Dr. Syros has published several books, including Vasileios of Padua at the intersection of ancient and medieval traditions of political thought, and Well Begun is only half done, tracing Aristotle's political ideas in medieval Arabic, Syriac, Byzantine, and Jewish sources. His scholarly work has appeared in a number of international peer-reviewed journals, including Renner Quarterly, Studies in History, Journal of Early Modern History, Intellectual History Review, Medieval Encounters, and Journal of World History. Dr. Syros has received fellowship from Harvard University, University of Michigan, Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton University. We will be speaking today on the problem of dirty hands in Ziya al-Din Barani and a comparison with Arabic political thought. With this, I hand over platform to Dr. Syros.
Thank you very much, Professor Jane, for your introduction. And I'm very grateful to Professor Ziya for his friendship and mentorship all these years. I started as a Western historian of Western Europe. I did medieval Renaissance Europe. So India is, in a sense, the kind of side project for my own work. And I'm very grateful to Ziya for his support and all his advice and feedback all these years. We've been corresponding about my work. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this forum and to be able to present my work, my very modest and limited expertise in Indian political thought. And I'd be very happy to receive your feedback, your thoughts, your criticisms about my current work and my plans about future research. In this presentation, my goal is to talk about a very important question in political theory and political philosophy that is designated with the term the dirty hands problem or question. It boils down to the question whether a ruler or a government has a right to proceed to pursue illicit acts that go against the constitution or institutions or laws or even the prevalent notions of morality in a society in order to pursue a certain objective that is favorable, that is conducive to the well-being of the state. And of course, this is a very important question even in our personal lives, to what extent are we entitled to proceed to such actions or deeds if they contravene a set of laws and rules, religious laws or our personal principles. So this is a very important, a very pressing question that many politicians and statesmen are confronted with within the ordinary flow of politics. And as you know, in politics, we have the kind of routine of political power, to use Max Weber's expression, that there's a system, there are rules, there's a procedure, it flows, but there are also certain cases, emergencies that go beyond the regular course of action. And a ruler or a government is called to deal with these exceptional cases and at times to go against the prevalent laws and principles in a specific society. This question, of course, has preoccupied modern thinkers like Michael Walzer. There's a very important debate about this question, also in the context of Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, to what extent a democratic government has a right to go beyond its territory and make war, for example. But it has a very important lineage in medieval and early modern political thought. As you know, a very important thinker who deals with this question is Machiavelli. And in a sense, his entire work of this Florentine thinker, Niccolo Machiavelli, especially in The Prince, is to what extent the ruler can use methods, certain methods to consolidate his power, but at the same time appear benign and benevolent to the people. So we have two layers here, two very important parallel notions of good government. One is methods that are judged based on their efficiency. I do something, and the extent to which I achieve my goal is a primary criterion for assessing the quality of my decision. But also there's a certain relationship between the ruler and his people, his citizens, his subjects. So the ruler has to appear benign, pious, to project a public persona that will help him secure the support of the people. And of course, Machiavelli draws a line between acts that are illicit, immoral, and acts that can evoke cruelty. And he has a number of examples of rulers in the past in history that crossed the line and they became cruel sovereigns. They lost their reputation. And he, as a humanist thinker, he's against going beyond the line and flirting with cruelty when it comes to those decisions. So there's a, as you understand, there is a very important distinction here between acts that are illicit, immoral, and something that is excessively wrong or cruel. And this distinction and the relationship between what is morally permissible, licit, and what is immorally frowned upon is a very important question that, in my sense, preoccupies thinkers in the Islamic context, but also earlier in Arabic political thought. So in my previous work on Barani, the very famous historian of the Delhi Sultanate, and of course Razi Akil is a major expert in this area. One of the major questions I've been dealing with all these years is to what extent Barani entertains a notion of dirty hands, and to what extent he believes that the ruler has the right to go against the Sharia or against the laws of society in order to preserve a certain territory, his realm. In an article which I wrote many years ago, it was about emergencies in Barani's thought and how a ruler is entitled to take certain measures to deal with emergencies, with situations that go beyond normalcy, that are not included, that are not part of the regular course of political action, political deeds. And he elaborates there. He elaborates upon those emergencies. He prescribes different courses of action depending on the emergency, the nature of the problem, and of course the implications of those actions. So, in my sense, a very central problem in Barani is, first of all, the relationship between religion and political power. Is there an overarching framework, religious framework, that guides political actions? And to what extent is the ruler, the sovereign, obliged to abide by this framework? And of course, the second question is to what extent the political community, society can exist without a strong, powerful ruler that will employ different methods in order to sustain this political entity. And I believe that, in a sense, what brings Barani close to Machiavelli, because I worked a lot on this comparative project between Barani and Machiavelli, is the belief that power is a key, is a foundation for a sustainable political order. Now, in various places in his Fatafai Jahadari, Barani stresses that a powerful, sustainable state requires a powerful ruler, and he clearly assigns precedence, supremacy to power over other forms of influence or power. I remember there's a very interesting section where he stresses that even if all the wise men of the world came together and tried to inculcate their beliefs, their principles in a society, they wouldn't be able to pursue that unless they had a modicum of political power in order to enforce their decisions. And it's very interesting that Barani envisions on certain occasions the ruler as a doctor, as a physician that needs to take care of the wealth of the health of the body politic. He needs to take measures, remedies against diseases, and in this process, he also needs to use punishment, to proceed to extreme actions in order to punish people threaten the internal order and peace of the state. Now, it's very important that what I see as very central to Barani is that he clearly believes that it's preferable to have a ruler that can occasionally tamper with religious laws instead of having a state of anarchy, a state of where of the state being dissolved. There are no rules. There's no order, and this is a theme that he shares with a number of thinkers in the Arabic context who deal with the same question. And I would describe this kind of mindset or attitude to the fact that these thinkers writing in the 13th, 14th century, they're writing against the background of the fall of the Abbasid caliphate. And at the same time, there's a distance, there's a growing distance between the golden era of the Prophet. There are efforts in early Islamic political philosophy to romanticize that era. Then we have the first four caliphs. We have the ideal society, and then at some point there's degeneration, there's corruption, there is decadence. So all the thinkers write against the background of the fall of the Abbasid caliphate. There's this growing distance and rupture with the golden past of Islam, and that's why I think they kind of privilege political power over religion. And clearly, in Barani, you see that in this relationship, in this interplay of religion and politics, he clearly privileges politics. He even says that at some point, if a ruler needs to be powerful and he needs to use various methods to support the state and solidify his power, he unavoidably needs to emulate the methods, the practices followed by the ancient rulers of Iran. There's always this kind of comparison between the Islamic rulers, the Muslim rulers, and also the Byzantine or the ancient Iranian rulers, kings. And you find this contrast even in Khaldun, who writes about the various dynasties, he writes about civilization, and he claims that at some point, Islam started to degenerate, to decay, because Muslim rulers were flirting increasingly with the practices, the style of leadership that was followed by ancient Iranian kings and Byzantine emperors. So the very fact that Muslim rulers were contaminated, in Khaldun's view, by adopting those methods from ancient Iran and the Byzantine Empire, was for him one of the major causes that led to the decadence of Islam, of Islamic civilization. But Barani, in a sense, rehabilitates those practices. He is very supportive of those practices when he says that the ruler, it's unavoidable, it's an inexorable necessity that the ruler at some point needs to employ those methods. So he realized that the dirty hands question is very central, because at some point the ruler cannot rule merely on the basis of religion or religious laws, and he needs to impose a certain order, to impose certain rules, certain laws in society in order to sustain a very complex, multi-ethnic entity that is extremely diverse, and it needs a central authority being able to enforce those decisions. It's very interesting that in Barani's time we have authors in the 13th century, 14th century who write about the same questions in light of the extinction, the destruction of the caliphate. And a major figure who writes about these problems, and this is again a comparison which I'm going to engage in and possibly write a longer piece of work on this comparison in two very different areas of Islam, which are confronted, however, with very similar concerns and preoccupations, is Ibn Jama. I mean, legal thinkers, jurists who deal with legal questions, and they do believe that the Sultan or the political leader needs to have to uphold the Islamic principles. Clearly, that's very important. But he does believe, Ibn Jama believes that a ruler that has obtained power, irrespective of the means he used to do that, is the de facto sovereign that needs to be obeyed. And this is very important because we have here kind of indifference to the methods that lead to political power. And we have a shift of focus on the persona of a ruler who is able to act as a guarantor of peace and order within a specific society. So he clearly distinguishes between two kinds of political power, or the office of the vizier, or he talks about a military leader, a military who takes power by force, and the caliph must delegate authority to him in order to sustain peace. But there's another very interesting point here that there's a very interesting anthropology that underpins all these ideas, all the theories about political power, again, against the background of the distinction of the caliphate. There's this anthropological concept that is, I think, very similar to Machiavelli, that human beings they need to live in a society, they need to cultivate mutual aid and support, but there are evil tendencies in human nature that need to be tamed by a very powerful ruler. Otherwise, they threaten to disrupt the order, the peace of society, and lead to a kind of anarchy and state of nature, to use Hobbes and Locke's doctrine expression. Another very important point is that those thinkers would never advocate rebellion, revolt against an unjust ruler. That's also very important. So you might have a ruler who is tyrannical, who is despotic. He does things against Islam, against the good of society. But if you have the choice to live in a society with that specific ruler who is far from perfect, and the option to have the destruction of society, they clearly privilege the former option. This is very interesting. Why? Because first of all, they don't want to go back, as I said, to a state of nature, anarchy, where you have no state, no political institutions. There's constant friction and divisions, but also because they prefer people to tolerate an unjust, evil leader and ruler instead of engaging in friction and civil war. In a sense, what Ibn Jama says is echoed by Ibn Taymiyyah, another thinker who writes in this very context, and he emphasizes that there's a distinction between the private persona of a ruler and his public his action in the public sphere. So a ruler might be unjust, might pursue evil deeds, might run against certain principles, and he will be accordingly just in the future, or in the future world. But his actions do not bear upon his function as a ruler, as a political leader. So again, you have a very important statement that the very fact that the ruler might commit unjust acts and, again, to use the expression, might make his hands dirty by doing stuff that go against certain moral and religious principles, does not necessarily mean that he will be judged by his own people, his own citizens, only by God. So you see that all these thinkers writing in the 13th, 14th century are very cautious about preserving the political unity and upholding the power, the authority of the ruler, again, against the background of the fall, of the extinction of the caliphate. And I think that it's very important to understand that the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate had very important implications in the ways in which those thinkers writing in different parts of Islam. I mean, Barani wrote in India, in the eastern parts of Islam. These thinkers wrote in the Mediterranean and Egypt. So the impact of the destruction of the Abbasid dynasty and the gradual fall of the Caliphate was felt across different parts of the Islamic world. So I think it's very important to see how these thinkers writing in almost the same period, but without having access to each other's works, were responding or engaging with those questions. And that brings me to a very important, I think, methodological problem here, or question. To what extent can we articulate this comparison between those thinkers, and to what extent is comparison or comparative political thought an enterprise, a venture that can help us look at these developments in the history of political thought, history of ideas in a comparative context, and look for similar patterns, sources, or ideas. And I think that the possible question here is that it's true that these thinkers do not read each other, but there's a common matrix, a common source, a common frame of reference, a common set of questions and preoccupations they're trying to respond to by writing political theory from very different perspectives. I mean, these thinkers are clearly writing from a legal perspective. They're jurists, they're like legal scholars. Barani is an ideologue or a political thinker enmeshed in the political structures of the Delhi Sultanate. He's part of the court. He's directly involved in politics, and he writes down, he records his experiences with the Delhi Sultanate period in both the Fatawat Chakadari, but also the history of Firoz Shah. And again, in Afif's work, we have a continuation of this problematic. And we, as I wrote earlier in an article that was published in Delhi in the Inside the History, that we have a different picture, a different image of a ruler that refrains from illicit acts, Firoz Shah, as portrayed by Afif, and he restores a failed, dysfunctional state. So you have the contrast between Firoz Shah as a good leader who refrains from bloodshed, from violence. He is more respectful of the people, of the common good. And then you have the erratic figure of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, as portrayed by Barani and also by Afif, that is compelled to proceed to actions that go against the morality, against the moral principles of the state and our religion. So I think that the comparative project can help us look at how these questions that I think are very central to Islamic political thinking after the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate were dealt with in these two very different contexts. And by doing that, we can articulate, we can produce, we can generate a global history of Islamic political thought in different parts of the Islamic world that can help us trace the reception of ideas, the evolution of certain doctrines and concepts, but also look at theories that were proposed by those thinkers as solutions, as remedies to some very pressing problems. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Aditi, you're audible.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Syros, for this wonderful lecture. We open the house for further discussions and questions. There are quite a few viewers on our Facebook page as well, where the lecture is being live streamed. So we'll also be taking the questions from Facebook. Before I take further questions, I would actually like to raise one myself. I was just wondering that since we are talking about the idea of power over religion, if I'm not mistaken in getting the concept correctly, I was wondering if the role of religion or the role of Sharia and if it was decreasing in its intensity in the politics of the time, was it also changing the meaning of the concept of religion itself, or the role of religion that was being played in the state and state politics? And what was the difference between the same thing in Europe vis-a-vis the same time period in India, or rather South Asia, I should say South Asia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that, and maybe Razi should maybe intervene in that. He's a real expert in this. I think that there is a kind of a different vision of the relationship between religion and politics, that there's an increasing tendency, I think, to enrich the repertoire of ideas and methods about government, about political power, that is not solely based on the Sharia or religious law, because people realize that there's a ever-growing state that is confronted with diversity, different with different needs that it didn't exist before. And again, the trauma, the big trauma was felt with the fall of the Abbasid caliphate. So I think that people had to revisit the importance of their Sharia. They had to revisit the importance of religion. They had to rethink how religion relates to politics and look for different solutions. And I think that this kind of relative indifference towards religious laws stems from the fact that that they realize that politics is a sphere that cannot solely operate on the basis of religion. And that's why I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for your response. I think Shagun wants to ask a question. Shagun, could you please unmute yourself and go ahead with your question?
First of all, thank you, Syros sir, for your intriguing lecture. Sir, I have a question that, yes, you one hand talk about Barani as one who is preferring politics over religion. But on other hand, we also have a other picture of Barani where he is close adherent of Sufi Saint Nizamuddin Aulia, who is somehow claiming a spiritual leadership over political authority in Delhi Sultanate. So how would we look these two images of Barani all together? And further that, even there is a close debate was going on in 13th century regarding the makulat and mankulat, that is rational or irrational sciences. So where according to Blaine, or he was preferring towards or taking a dig on makulat, and he quoted that it leads to doubt in the religion of the correct way of community. So how would you respond to these? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is a great question, and both Blaine Auer and Razi have dealt with this question, and Barani's relation to Sufism. And of course, Barani is a very complex figure, a very complex thinker, multifaceted, that it's hard to reconcile the different aspects of his thinking and produce a coherent political philosophy. Now, I would say that at least my reading of the fatwa, and when it comes to this question about the dirty hands and the need for the ruler to employ illicit methods and implement illicit decisions, his actions, is that when it comes to politics, when it comes to government, he clearly privileges, I think, politics over religion. He does want to retain the modicum of religiosity, of course. There's religious laws, but I think deep down he believes that that a sound government has its own rationale, its own principles that are not always compatible with the principles of religion. And as I said earlier, in a very cynical way, he claims that he stresses that the ruler in the process of governing a state will at some point need to employ the methods of the Kisra and the Byzantine emperors and the ancient Iranian leaders, because politics necessitates the use of those methods. So for him, it's a fact, it's obvious. He takes for granted that politics cannot operate solely within the religious framework. And I think that he's one of the few thinkers of the time who stresses that religion is not sufficient to run a state. Now, of course, he has his pro-Sufi sympathies, and Razi and Blaine have done a great job showing those links, and I'd be happy if Razi could maybe comment on this later. But as I said earlier, there's even in the early Arabic tradition, there's a kind of the philosophers like Al-Farabi, like Ibn Rushd, who claim who advocate for a philosophical model for political organization, a kind of utopia, the philosopher king, but who are again very close to the golden era of Islam. And their model, which is very Platonic in a sense, is deeply imbued and colored by the belief in a perfect ruler who is absolutely virtuous, a philosopher king, a philosopher ruler, who does not exist anymore after the 13th century. I mean, people would not write again about this philosopher king that was advocated by the early philosophers of Islam, like Al-Farabi. Instead, what I see here is that even jurists writing the Arabic tradition realize that a ruler, however imperfect he might be, is necessary to preserve the order of the state. And they're willing to accommodate that ruler instead of having to look for a perfect model, a perfect, an exemplary leader who is perfect in both moral and intellectual sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question from Facebook. And the question says that since we are talking about power and justice and continuity of power in politics, is it also, can it be a replacement for Sharia? And in that case, what is the relationship between Sharia and justice?
You're right. I mean, that's a good question. So the Sharia, in a sense, provides one of the frameworks that can determine whether an action of a ruler is just or not, right? And it's a normative framework. But I think justice, or at least political justice, goes beyond the Sharia. So although the Sharia is binding, and the Sharia is very important in terms of shaping a ruler's behavior and political action, I think justice is something that involves, I would say, commitment to the common good. It will involve other things that maybe are not enshrined in the Sharia. And again, if you have a state that is very diverse, and this question is very acute later with Abu Fazl, with the Mughals, that does not necessarily subscribe to the Sharia, what is justice? How is justice configured in a state that the majority of this, the majority of which does not support the Sharia? Do you impose a Sharia, or do you expect non-Muslims to abide by the Sharia, or how do you express justice? And the same happens with the Ottomans. The Ottomans had a very diverse empire that was composed by different nations and ethnic religious groups that did not necessarily operate in accordance with the Sharia. So how does a just ruler operate in this very diverse state? What does it mean for a Christian subject of an emperor, for example, or a Jewish subject to have a just, efficient ruler? And I think there's a kind of, I might be a bit anachronistic here, kind of contract, kind of agreement that the ruler needs to deliver certain things to the people. He needs to protect the realm, he needs to protect their safety, he needs to protect certain things and to facilitate certain, like agriculture, certain activities that are part of justice. And don't forget that the very important part of how people envision justice in this period is the so-called cycle of justice. We've talked about this in the past, that there's a cycle, there are different groups within the state with different vocational priorities: soldiers, religious scholars, there's farmers, there's craftsmen, there's like 4 major professional divisions that rely on each other. They're interrelated. So justice prevails when those parts, those sectors of the state support each other. None of these sectors tries to hinder or to impose itself upon the function of the rest of the society. And of course, the ruler is there to coordinate these various parts of the state. So a just ruler is a ruler that was able to facilitate, to uphold, to guarantee the coordination of the different parts of the state that work together to sustain the whole. Thank you.
If I can ask Aditi, can I ask?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I was about to.
Thank you, Vasileios. These are very, very important concerns in terms of the question of violence and the problem of legitimacy for such violence. So violence in the wake of the conquests and rebellions, etc., by the sultans were acceptable. And yet when it came to governing principles and legitimacy for the violence, then certainly invocation to religion was made by rulers as also by ideologues, etc. But I was reading parts of Barani's chapter on Muhammad Tughlaq, where he's the personal advisor of Muhammad Tughlaq for 17 years or more as a boon companion or Nadim, where he's saying that often the Sultan was consulting him and other people, and yet most of the time he was not listening to what the Sharia says about what the Sultan should be doing, and therefore it is a matter of great concern that for the lust of power and position that he is continued to be part of the Sultanate, but on the day of judgment he would be questioned, and then at that point of time he will not have the answer to all the violations from within the point of view of the Shariat. And yet in Fatwa Jandari and other places he's mentioning that how Shariat cannot be implemented as a rule of law in a context like the Delhi Sultanate. So, and the rulers can be utterly irreligious in their personal practice, and yet invocation to religion can be made from time to time. And the concern, as I said, concern is about ensuring peace and order in the dominion. He would be saying in the city. And this, because we're mentioning about the Arabic political thought, this is an outstanding concern because you remember this statement by Ghazali also, that one day of anarchy in the streets of the city is worse than 1,000 years of despotism, by the most tyrants of the rulers. So this is a concern, and which the political thinkers, ideologues, etc., they are grappling with, and which is a problem with Barani also, because this reference to the previous question, his association with Amir Khosrow and Amir Hassan Sizzi and Nizamuddin Aulia is being counted as a close disciple of Nizamuddin Aulia, that his biography figures in Siyar al-Aulia, and yet he's the same person who is speaking in these terms at a different register altogether in terms of heavy use of the political power for suppressing the rebels, suppressing the kafirs, whereas we know the large majority of Hindus are not kafirs, technically, theoretically, they are called people of the book, and therefore jizya setup could be demanded, and yet this need for the heavy hand that the rulers, Alauddin Khalji or Muhammad Tughlaq, for instance, would be, and justification of that violence, and yet this tension that how far this violence is justifiable remains. But is it not true for the medieval period? Not so much early modern, but medieval period, because early modern Europe will have a different proposition altogether in terms of the rulers thinking that if they have the power to conquer, they also have the power to control the lives of the people and govern, and therefore that they don't need religion. But in the medieval period, and in the context like India, even in the early modern period, this invocation and justification of power and violence, etc., in the name of religion is established practice.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, two things here. One is that, as we discussed earlier, and I was very grateful for your feedback on that point, is that thinkers who wrote in the context of, like Ibn Khaldun, later Abu Fazl, who wrote in the context of those large imperial conglomerates that were primarily found in military conquests, right? They felt the need to stress how government would sustain peace and harmony And of course, economic prosperity. That's very important. And that, of course, was based on a system of political organization and an administration that would involve capable officials that could coordinate the different parts of the administration. And you have, in theory, a wise philosopher, king, or ruler that would enjoy a special position as a kind of charismatic, divinely appointed holder of legitimate political authority. And of course, in this context, you had exceptional situations, emergencies that would pose a threat to the entire state, right, to the security of the ruler, and he would often need to proceed to take drastic decisions, measures, and use force in order to suppress those groups that would threaten the entire state. And that brings to violence, as you said earlier. I think Barani does believe that violence is related to political power. And I think his problem with Muhammad is that at some point he became excessive. He used an excessive amount of force and violence. He crossed the line. We have a similar thing in Machiavelli. He writes about Agathocles, a famous king in Sicily, who was a capable ruler, who was a capable commander, but he became cruel. He used an excessive amount of power and force, and that's why he was condemned in history. And I think Barani's problem is that Muhammad at some point was vain, he was erratic, and he wouldn't consult with the people, with his advisors. He wouldn't care about counsel, he would not deliberate, and he would become he lost his self-control. And that situation had spillover effects in different parts of the administration, the economy, and I think that's his like nightmare when it comes to the use of violence and the use of political power. Now, there was a question on chat about, which I think relates to your question, Razi, about Madhurani asked this question about Barani writes, and you're right, that the Sultan is a combination of conflicting qualities and virtues and how to employ them. And I think you're right that for him, the whole secret, the key to good government, to efficient government, is to what extent the ruler is able to combine those features, those qualities, and make proper use of those qualities, and when. That's something we have in Machiavelli as well. We have the different qualities, right? Force, we have generosity, liberality, but the good ruler needs to be able to discern, to determine when to use and to what extent a specific virtue or quality in which situation. And I think this very statement encapsulates Barani's theory and idea about what is about the dirty hands. That at times, as Machiavelli says, you need to be the fox to be the lion, right? And at times you need to be the lion to be firm, to be determined, to make, to proceed to illicit actions. But again, the success of a ruler is to be able to make a proper use of those qualities. And there's no statistical data that would determine what percentage you should use and when. But again, that's a secret, I think. That's the key to good government. Thank you.
If I can quickly add to this tension about religion and especially Shariat, which is basically Sunni Hanafi interpretation of Islam and principles, sources of Islamic traditions, which were to be applied, and in the name of which were conquests, unleashed, Lashkar Islam and Jihad and all that categories used. And yet, I'm remembering in Fatah Jahandari, Barani has also mentioned about how if Prophet Muhammad were to come to Delhi Sultanate in the 13th, 14th century and came with the same old teachings that he did in Arabia in the 7th century, he will not succeed in converting large, winning over large numbers of followers of the kind that he got in the Arabs. So the times have changed, and the place has changed, and the people have also changed. the Indian people are not the same. India is not the same as 7th century Arabia. 14th century is not the same as 17th century. And therefore, Shariat of the kind that is associated with the career of the Prophet cannot be implemented in the Indian situation in the 14th century, in the 13th, 14th century. Has he not written this? He has, I think, he has written this. And at the same time, he has mentioned about how it is important for the sultans to which you were pointing out, to have these contradictory qualities of God, because the sultans are representing themselves as Zille Ilahi, as Zillullah, as Ghafuddin Balban would be doing, all of them. And therefore, it is perfectly justifiable for the sultans to be both merciful and be a tyrant at the same time, because God can be wrathful and God can be also, beneficent, merciful, and the same qualities are to be shown, by the rulers in terms of discrimination, depending on situations of where justice is to be done. Then justice has to be done in that manner, and where a heavy hand is required, heavy hand is justifiable because the qualities of the Prophet and his teachings of the 7th century Arabia cannot be imitated in the Indian situation in the 14th century. I think he has written about this.
Yeah, I think there's something like that. If the Prophet went somewhere, people would not really be receptive. And I think he's aware of the fact that there's a profound anthropological dimension here, that compared to the beginning of Islam, we have a different era, there's different conditions, we have a interaction with non-Muslims, we have states that include non-Muslim populations. And in a sense, if you want to impose a Sharia, you either have to change human nature and make everybody nice and receptive to Sharia, or have a very strong agency that is able to impose a Sharia and impose those regulations or rules. And I think he realizes that, like many people in the 30th century, that the Sharia is not a sufficient framework for running a state. Sharmila wants to ask a question. Hello?
Sharmila, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, of course.
Yes. Thank you for the talk, Professor Syros. I was just wondering, I'm not a student of medieval India, but I was just wondering, since you talk about Machiavelli, and Machiavelli is placed in early modern Europe, that is the 16th century, and Barani is 14th century India. So when we look at 14th century Europe, we do have this concept of the divine rights of the king, it extends in the 16th century, it is there to be seen also in the 17th century, in England as well as in France. So I was wondering as to whether we should also talk about other, I'm not aware of other political theorists apart from, I think, Jean Baudin, who also talks about kingship in the 16th century. But how far is it correct to compare, say, what Machiavelli is writing in the 16th century Europe and what Barani is writing in 14th century medieval India? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, we have this theory about the divine origin of kingship in Europe and the divine rights of kings. And of course, this is something later that will resurface with absolutism in France. But in a sense, Barani prefigures or says things much earlier than Machiavelli in Europe, which is very interesting. Because we in Europe think that the real rupture, the real thing is Machiavelli. This is the watershed between the medieval and the modern. And of course, Machiavelli is being incubated by Vasileios of Padua, by other thinkers in Europe, but he's a crucial transition to modernity. He's a rupture with the past. But what Machiavelli says about political power, which we think is a very revolutionary, very radical, and he opens a new chapter, a new era in the history of political thought in Europe, is actually expressed by Barani in different terms, in different contexts, already 2 centuries earlier than Machiavelli. And that's very, very interesting. So the question is, Machiavelli did not say these things because he was smarter than other people, but because Barani said these things because he was confronted with these situations that would maybe preoccupy Machiavelli a couple of centuries later than Barani. And as I said, Barani is not a systematic thinker. He's also very erratic in his writing, but I think that he expresses doctrines and truths that are very important, and that will help us in the West, as Western historians, as Western intellectual historians, realize that Machiavelli is not something distinctive, something unique in Western intellectual history or political thought. That what he says, which is of course very revolutionary and very important, was expressed in other contexts because people were confronted with similar problems, similar questions, and similar challenges, like Barani.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor, I have just one last question. Okay, sorry. I think there's a question.
Okay.
Aditi, can I go ahead with my question?
Yes, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, I am working on 16th century on one chronicle. There I come across the concept of failed state, failed sultanate concept. So, of course, as Razi sir has also mentioned, that in Persian societies, justice encompasses Shariat. It was more than that. And my question is that in 16th century, I'm working on Kashmir, which was also part of Persianate cosmopolis. The chroniclers in Kashmir, they just go beyond these Shariat concepts and justice. They just compare Kashmir Sultanate with the Mughals. They think that Mughals are sort of an ideal society, like you mentioned also. So my question is that their failed Sultanate is basically that the rulers in Kashmir, they are not able to respect that circle of justice. They are not able to these four Chahar Arkan, like Ahl Saif, Kalam, these agricultural groups. So how Barani actually treats this crisis, this failed Sultanate, because he also was sort of a conservative realist, and similarly these chroniclers are also having same conceptions of Sultanate. So what is basically this failed state concept? This is what actually I'm very confused about. Yeah.
Very, very big question. Now, I mean, and I recently published a paper with Raz's encouragement on this topic. Now, so I would say that in this case, I mean, the term failed state is a modern term. It is a modern term in political science. So it's none of the thinkers use the term failed state, right? That's clear. But I think in their mind, a failed state is a state or that is unable, it does not have the capacity to deliver some basic goods and service to the people, like security, justice, a modicum of prosperity, that fails to provide those services and those goods to the people. And I think Muhammad at some point was a failed state, was a failed governor, a failed ruler, because he was not able to guarantee the delivery of those services and the goods to the people. He made wars, there was economic crisis, there was devastation. He made a new capital, people need to move to the new capital, people died. And that was a failed state. Now, as I wrote in the article, there are aspects that pertain to failed states, and you can find in even today in the most advanced states of the world. I mean, even Sweden, which is supposed to be a very advanced country, has aspects of a failed state. Or even in America, the US, there was no consensus about the budget for a while, and the whole administration was paralyzed, right? These are aspects that pertain to failure, but of course, none of us would classify the United States or Sweden as a failed state. But there's a concept of a failed state or a failed government, in the sense, as I said earlier, and maybe I think that pertains to your interpretation of those chronicles in relation to the Mughals, that the state does not have the ability to provide those services. And I think it seems that the thinker you're referring to makes this comparison between the Mughals as a very powerful centralized state that is able to provide those services. And the contrast is the Kashmir state he's writing about, that maybe is not able to provide those services. But again, how those thinkers define the failed state is something that is correlated to how they define the good state, or what is a good ruler. And Razi was also very, very helpful in terms of helping me link my whole thesis about the failed state to what is successful leadership, what is good leadership, because this is always a very subjective, very relative way of thinking about a failed state, because a failed state is the antithesis, is the corrupt form of a good state, of what is the ideal state. And I think this author might be using the Mughals as a frame of reference, as a device to criticize his own realities in Kashmir and portray them as the instantiation of what is a good state, what is a powerful, efficient state. That's one interpretation.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Syros, for your wonderful lecture and for catering to so many questions. It was, I'm sure there are many other questions as well, but we shall close today's talk.
Thank you very much for your hospitality. I hope to see you in person at some point once this pandemic is over. And I'm very grateful for your feedback and your questions. And please feel free to write me an email if you have any additional questions or criticisms. I very much appreciate your feedback.
Thank you so much, Professor Syros. We shall be meeting next week, that is on the 27th of this month at 3:30 p.m. for our next lecture, which is titled Monuments and Monumentization, Making Sense of the Idea of Heritage in Post-Colonial India, by Dr. Hilal Ahmed. Hope to see you all next week. Thank you so much.